Un aereo è caduto. A bordo v'erano 3 uomini, il pilota Bertuzzi, il giornalista americano McHale e Enrico Mattei, il presidente dell'ENI, l'uomo che aveva creato la più grande azienda di Stato di tutto il mondo occidentale.
Sono profondamente angosciato di questa tragedia. Scompare con Enrico Mattei un grande protagonista delle vicende politiche ed economiche della storia recente del nostro paese. Scompare con lui un eroe della Resistenza e un costruttore del miracolo economico italiano, e vorrei dire che scompare con lui un grande servitore del paese.
He was so celebrated that he is the only figure in the history of oil to receive a national burial. Sadly, his death marked the end of a heroic time for Italian oil, but his legacy is well remembered. His story began during the post-war period. Italy was a defeated and ravaged country whose economy depended essentially on the United States. Without resources or an oil industry, it had to rely on the majors for its fuel. AGIP, a small stagnant oil company created by the fascists, was the sole competitor to the majors' dominance. No one believed it had a future except Mattei, who agreed to run it. It was to be the starting point of his fight. His aim was to build a state company to rival the majors and put an end to their monopoly. In 1953, he founded and became the president of the ENI, the Italian National Office of Hydrocarbon, which was entirely state-run. As soon as he took up his post, he showed the majors his intentions and nationalized a gas deposit in the north of the country. Through their ambassador, Lucy Booth, the United States objected, but to no avail. Mattei, taking advantage of his influence and prestige as a former anti-fascist, passed a law preventing Italy from falling under the control of the most powerful Anglo-American companies. From then on, he had freedom to fulfill his ambitions. In the years that followed, he sent his geologists to find new oil fields so Italy would have independent supplies. He was a Christian humanist who remained faithful to his roots, and so his dealings with the Third World, where Italy prospected for oil, were always based on respect and consideration. This was the case in Nigeria and Egypt. In 1955, he offered an association contract to the Egyptian National Oil Company. It was considerably more attractive than those the majors had imposed on them. 2 years later, he employed the same strategy in Iran, which angered the Americans, who had imposed their power in the region since Mossadegh's fall. The American ambassador advised the Shah of Iran against accepting this new type of agreement. Though the Shah was pledged to his benefactor, he couldn't bear such interference in domestic affairs and opened Iran's doors to ENI. In 1960, Mattei went one step further towards energy independence by opening negotiations with Khrushchev's government. The USSR was once again a large oil-producing country and responsible for 15% of world production. The Russians, only too happy to sell their stocks and enter the Western market, offered ENI some very attractive contracts. The Americans took it as a double slap in the face. For them, Mattei was not only a traitor to the free world for dealing with the communists, but what was more, he had entered into unfair competition against the majors by buying crude oil instead of refined oil. Nevertheless, for Mattei, it supplied the vehicle to make his dream come true, open up the refining and petrochemical industry to ENI and so to Italy. It took him less than 10 years to achieve this. With his David and Goliath fight against the majors, Mattei laid the basis of the changes the oil world would undergo during the 1960s. In the Cold War atmosphere of the early 1950s, Marxist ideology prevailed in many of the countries fighting for their independence. Revolutionary Cuba became the model for guerrilla warfare movements developing in Latin America, while outdated European colonial powers had their own problems with overseas colonies. The leaders of 24 African and Asian countries, non-aligned countries as they were called, gathered at the 1955 Bandung Conference. Their political desire for self-determination, along with a stronger desire to manage their economies themselves, was crystallized there. In such volatile times internationally, Shell and British Petroleum, soon followed by other majors, unilaterally decided to cut the already low price of oil by 9% due to overproduction. This decision provoked anger from the newer oil-producing countries, as it was their main source of income. Two men would lead the struggle, which little by little was to undermine the majors' power. These men were Perez Alfonso, Venezuela's energy minister, who was well respected by the oil leaders of the Arab countries, and his Saudi counterpart, Abdullah Tariki, a radical nationalist the Americans called the Red Sheikh.
Tariki et Perez Alfonso sont tout de suite tombés d'accord sur un objectif majeur, à savoir, il ne faut plus que le prix du pétrole baisse. Par contre, la part des pays producteurs dans les revenus de ce pétrole doit augmenter parce qu'elle est injustement réduite. À partir de ces objectifs très clairs, un message a été lancé lors du premier congrès arabe du pétrole qui s'est tenu au Caire et auquel Perez Alfonso s'est invité de lui-même, bien qu'il soit vénézuélien et donc non arabe. Lors de ce congrès et en marge de ce congrès, des réunions secrètes ont eu lieu. Pourquoi secrètes? Parce que il faut se placer dans la mentalité des pays de l'époque. Ils avaient peur des pays occidentaux, ils avaient peur de l'emprise des compagnies pétrolières occidentales qui étaient fortement représentées dans les coulisses de ce congrès, qui surveillaient les rencontres entre représentants des différents États. Donc ces deux hommes ont organisé des réunions secrètes auxquelles ont participé également des Irakiens, des Koweïtiens, etc. Et c'est là qu'ils ont décidé de conclure un pacte, ce qu'on a appelé le pacte de Mahdi, du nom du lieu où ce pacte a été conclu dans une station balnéaire en fait en Égypte. Eh bien, ce pacte dit très clairement, si jamais les compagnies pétrolières récidivent en réduisant à nouveau le prix du pétrole, nous réagirons.
Of course, the majors didn't take these warnings seriously. On September the 10th, 1960, just 1 year after the secret meeting, the signatories of the Mahdi Pact, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait and Venezuela, met again in Baghdad. After 4 days of sometimes stormy talks, the delegates agreed to create an association aimed at defending their common interests. It was to be called OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. The main aim of the body, which is still its aim today, was to set a common price for their oil. In Western countries, the creation of OPEC was largely ignored, scorned and regarded with skepticism. The Washington Post wrote that OPEC was a bellicose conglomerate of emirates, chancellors and banana republics. As for the majors, they predicted it would only last a few months before it split. However, over 40 years after it was created, OPEC is still one of the main protagonists on the international oil scene. During the 1960s and 1970s, the 5 founding countries, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and Iran, were soon joined by 6 new members: Qatar, Libya, Indonesia, Abu Dhabi, Algeria, and Nigeria.